used to work as an EMT, and I have seen plenty of stuff in my day. Here are a handful of stories that shook me to my core. The first one is probably one that I try not to dwell on often. This happened around 20 years ago. It was a dark and rainy night, and I was just chatting with a friend of mine. We get a call to a nearby hit and run. We sped out fairly quickly and made our way to the scene. A guy had been hit by a car. To us, it was just your standard procedure. We checked for a pulse, saw if he was still alive, and the guy was barely breathing. So we get him up on a stretcher and into our vehicle. We rush him to the hospital, trying to check as much as we can before we arrive and stabilize him. In his condition, he had cuts up and down his body, and his leg was particularly bad. I wasn't sure if we were going to be able to save that one. As we arrived at the hospital, we're greeted by other emergency staff and hand over the patient. He really is in a bad shape. He's losing a lot of blood, and they look down at his leg. We know we're gonna have to amputate. That's where I left it. A few years later is where the story gets particularly gnarly. We get a similar call for a hit and run. We go out to investigate, and it's the same guy. His leg, as it turns out, did have to end up being amputated. He lost that the last time. And this time, we look down, and again his leg is completely mangled. Oh boy, I think this guy isn't gonna have any legs left. We put him into the ambulance and drive him away. Same hospital, same doctor. He looks down, looks up at us, and goes, "Deja vu." It was a very weird and odd sensation. I actually followed this one up and was told that the guy lost his other leg. Very weird experience to happen. Then, after asking about, some of the nurses had managed to ascertain a little bit of information about him. Turns out, he was a local drunk. He always used to go to a nearby bar and used to come home by crossing the highway. So it was entirely his own doing. After his first leg got amputated, fortunately just below the knee, he had enough left to get an artificial leg made and managed to trudge himself over the highway. However, this time he was not as successful on his nighttime endeavor and lost his other leg, all for taking a shortcut. If this story taught me anything, it's that shortcuts that put your life in danger are never worthwhile. Of course, I've had your fair share of terrible calls too. It was your standard plea for an ambulance, and they weren't sure what exactly was going on. They were hearing noises in the other house, and they sent us and the cops over in case it was something serious. Turns out, a little girl had barricaded herself in her room. The stepfather had been beating her. The mother had just let it happen. This wasn't going to end well. The stepfather had been drinking and was battering on the door with a hammer. And if the police hadn't arrived when they did, I shudder to think what would have happened to this child. She couldn't have been any more than 8, cowering in a corner in her filthy, dark, and dank room. Human feces was in the corner and some of the walls. It had been very clear to us that this girl had been long time neglected, forgotten, and abused. It was very sad to see her like this. We went in, extracted the child, checked her, and apart from bruises and cuts, she seemed relatively fine. She was, however, extremely malnourished. Her face was gaunt, her skin was a ghostly gray pale color, and her eyes, they looked like the eyes of a 50-year-old. The stuff that she had seen, that she had had to endure, it wasn't right. Both the mother and the boyfriend got long a time in prison for neglect and abuse. I don't know about the girl, as you can't keep track of her while in the system. All that I know is that I hope she's okay and she's in a better place. Her name hasn't come up since, and I haven't seen her, so I hope she's doing okay. The last story is a call from when I had just started this job. We were dispatched to an old woman's house. It was told to us that all she requested was an ambulance and hung up the phone. So, we weren't entirely sure what to expect. We pull up with no degree of haste and start looking around for where the emergency might be. After knocking on the door and getting no reply, we look around the house and the garden. It doesn't seem to be anyone here. We knock again, and that's when the door opens by itself with a creak. We let ourselves in, declaring ourselves and asking if there's an emergency. There's no reply. We're not supposed to go into a house like this without the police, so we step back because we shouldn't go investigate and call the cops in case it's dangerous. Within a few minutes, they make their way here and lead the investigation in the house. letting the occupants know that they're coming in to search for the emergency and to please lower any weapons they have. They go in and find no one. So, we go into the house and start searching. There really is no one here. They let us know that the call had indeed been received from that exact residence. Whether it be a prank or a ghost, we will never know. I was working in London for 2 weeks, staying in a flat owned by a friend of a friend while he was out of town. About halfway through the job, I got food poisoning and was pretty sick for 3 days. I still had to work. I got home one night about 12 and was chilling in the front room, reading a book before going to bed, when I thought someone else was in the room. I looked up, and there was a Native American dude standing in the middle of the room. He was wearing some kind of vest or waistcoat, and I saw dark lines running up his forearm. He raised his hand, said some stuff directly to me, and just vanished. I wasn't scared, just a bit strange, and I went to bed. A few hours later, I woke up and wasn't sick anymore, and I drew a portrait of him in my sketchbook. A few days later, I was back home, sitting on some stairs waiting for my girlfriend, when the name Little Crow popped up into my head. I wrote it next to my drawing. About 6 months later, I hadn't mentioned this experience to many people. The original friend whose flat I stayed in gave me a book of Native American history, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and there was a chapter about a Dakota chief called Little Crow. The photo of him looks like my drawing. He always wore long sleeves because he was shot by his brother when he was younger, and the bullet passed through both his arms. The wounds became infected and left ugly scars that he was embarrassed about. This happened to my cousin. This was years ago, but we have a family home in the province of the Philippines, and we refer to it as the White House because there are supposed to be ghosts there. In Filipino culture, ghosts are all white. If they are another color, they're demons. I don't completely remember why we were there, but I remember it was time to eat dinner, so our uncle told my cousin to wake up his mom who was sleeping downstairs. My cousin Jared didn't want to go up there because he knew that's where the ghosts were. So, my uncle said, "It's up to you. Your mom won't be able to eat then." So Jared got really worried that his mother wouldn't be able to eat dinner, so he went up the rickety old staircase and entered the first 3 rooms. He saw his mom sleeping under the blanket, so he went to shake her awake. Before he could put his hands on the blanket, he heard a voice call out, "Gerard!" He quickly turned and saw his mom standing in the doorway. When he looked back at the bed, the blanket was laying completely flat. When I was about 16, my cousins Lena and Vincent were visiting from New Mexico. They are both a few years older than me, but we got along really well. I'm the youngest of all the grandkids on Katie's side, and the only grandkid on Aga's. So, I always looked forward to seeing these two. They were staying with us for a few days over the summer. They were both in college by that point, and they wanted to have some time away from the heat before they went back to their rigorous schedules. Their dad, Katie's brother Max, was there as well. He was a paleontologist and was intending to do some digging in the tundra while he was there. Around the second week of their stay, Katie and Gloria went with Max to his site, leaving Aga to entertain us youngsters. She was feeling a bit under the weather, so she requested that the 3 of us go out and do some of the maintenance she had been working on in the cemetery. Weeds aren't much of an issue here, but grass, flowers, and other plants die when the weather is so inconsistent. Every June and July, we would go to all of the grave sites and clean them up. I'd been relieved of my duties because my cousins were in town, but Aga didn't want it getting back it up. Plus, she'd promised to drive us into the city the next day and treat us to dinner and a movie if we helped. Vincent was surprisingly squeamish about the cemetery. He kept asking me why the tombs were so easy to open and freaking out about the possibility of something jumping out at him. They got to the point where Lena and I couldn't take it anymore and asked him to go sit on one of the concrete benches that lined the fence. As he was going over, he let out a groan and covered his nose. "What the hell is that smell?" he shouted. There was an unspoken rule in my family that we were to never speak of hell or demons within the gates of the cemetery. so I immediately shushed my cousin and asked him to say a prayer aloud to ask for forgiveness. But he ignored me and pointed at one of the tombs. "Why is that one broken?" he demanded. I went over to see what he was talking about and was startled to realize that one of our newer tombs, the one belonging to the village shaman's late mother, had a large crack down the middle. It looked like it had been sloppily broken and then reassembled. The intense smell coming from it suggested the body was well into the decomposition process. For some idiotic reason, I pulled my shirt over my nose and crouched down to further inspect the grave. I shifted some of the smaller pieces of stone to the side and peered into the hole I'd made. Of course, the first thing I saw was the old woman's rotten hand. She had died 2 months before at the age of 102. Her skin had been like tissue paper, so her bones were already visible beneath the remaining tissue. The rest of the body was connected, and everything that had been buried seemed to be there. When the initial shock from seeing a deteriorated corpse wore off, I did notice something rather shocking. The body was positioned with the head towards the north. In Anuak culture, only men are buried with their heads facing north. Females were buried facing the south because they got cold easily. We never would have mixed this up, and even if we had, many people would have come to view the body for days before it was finally laid to rest. Someone would have said something if she had been positioned wrong. This revelation is what truly sent me into panic mode. Someone came in and not only desecrated a grave, which is twisted no matter which cultural belief system you're from, but they also rearranged the body in a way that could affect their spirit negatively. This woman could now be suffering in the land of souls. I ran inside without a word to my cousin, arguing about what to do about this. She used to tell me stories of grave robbers from her childhood. These were fishermen from a town over, and their goal was to steal the jewelry and pelts that our dead have been buried in. When I finally woke my mother from her NyQuil coma, she pulled on her jacket and followed me outside to the vandalized grave. Vincent was standing just outside of the cemetery now, his face white as a sheet. He obviously hadn't told Lena about our discovery because she was on the other side of the yard, plucking dead flowers out of the ground. Aga yelled at her to come and take her brother inside. When Lena waltzed over, she noticed Vincent was shaking and taunted him in a high-pitched voice. "Ooh, little buddy, did you see a ghost?" Aga shoved him towards the house and demanded that he pray for forgiveness. She then asked Lena to call the police in the next city over. Matters such as this had to be dealt with by a higher authority than the ones our town had to offer. Surprisingly, Aga allowed me to stay behind and help her examine it. I chalked this up to her being drunk on NyQuil. She was just stunned with the state of the grave and the body inside. Her experience prior to this had been greedy white men who wanted quality ivory and labradorite jewelry. For some reason, that was easier to accept than someone deliberately dooming the spirits of those who were laid to rest. The police came along with the shaman of the next village over. The one in our town was unable to perform a proper ceremony due to his relationship with the deceased. We have all been assured the woman's spirit is at peace now. There were no suspects as to who desecrated the grave, and it never happened again. So, the police didn't really follow up with us after that. As you can imagine, my cousins refused to go into the cemetery after that. I grew up in a very rural area in the Appalachians. There was no town for half an hour or longer drive in any direction, no traffic lights, just back roads and terrifying houses, and a lot of forests. I grew up without limited electricity, water, and all of that jazz, as did most of the people around me. We had a set of well-off retirees move in pretty close to my house on the opposite side of the mountain. They built a fancy house on the other side of the mountain, and had a good long winding 1-mile-long driveway from the main mountain road. I knew the neighbors simply as Steve and Joanne. Steve and Joanne ended up getting custody of 3 of their grandchildren when I was about 3 years old. They were very young and had developmental delays. One was deaf, one was quadriplegic, and the youngest, Jonathan, I'm not exactly sure what was wrong with him. He was slow, wore a helmet, and that kind of thing, but I was too little to know. Since we lived in an old, unsettled territory where there is a ton of exposed wells from old foundations and cabins, my dad was always very cautious about where I played because of the danger of them. Despite Steve and Joanne's precautions, no one apparently knows how Jonathan got outside one day and wandered out into the woods and fell in one of those wells. It happened to be one that had water in it, and he drowned. I was around 5 years old, and I remember hearing when the cops found his body. He had drowned, and how inconceivable that was to me as a kid. I went to the funeral as well, and after this, the family built a large gated deck around the house that was airtight to protect the kids, just in case. It was a huge project and an absolutely gigantic locked gate. My mom hung out with the family pretty often, so I was dragged over there for quite a few years until I was 8 or so. She would do work for them, like clean their house or milk their goats, and I just wandered on the creepy deck on the side of the mountain and felt very unsettled. I got those feelings a lot as a kid, and to tell the truth, I had forgotten about the little boy who died. Anyway, I just remember being in the house and hating it there. Then one day, Steve and Joanne just up and left. They left everything and moved to Alaska. That was the rumor anyway. The house sat empty. I used to see the house through the woods when I was out exploring, and I remember it because none of my dogs would ever go towards the house at all. I could sometimes hear these loud scrapes and booms. Think of a sound that a tin sheet would make if you stomped on it. And it felt like the empty house was looking back at me. I attributed the sound to bears or deer or other loud animals and avoided it. One day, I was about 10 years old and saw an old truck peel into the driveway. I alerted my father, who grabbed his gun and jumped into his truck. He's a pretty aggressive paranoid mountain man, and he followed the truck up. When he returned, I asked him who it was, and he refused to talk to me. But Sneaky Me pretended to play outside, but was actually outside the window, listening as he told my mom what happened. The men in the other truck were 2 of Steve's sons. They had told my dad they were there to get one final look at the house that they helped build, because it was being sold. And they apparently asked my dad if he had ever gotten a weird feeling from the house. My dad said no. And as he explained it to my mom, he said while they were out there helping build that deck, they heard the sound of kids running around the planks. And at one time, he saw a shadow fall over his back, and the shadow was a young kid wearing a helmet. This absolutely petrified me, and I never told anyone what I heard. Fast forward a few years when I was 12. I got really into horseback riding. However, after a few months of near misses from idiotic speeding drivers on the road, my dad had enough and banned me to mountain trail riding only. In his opinion, it was safer. I would have agreed at this point if he would have let me carry a knife or gun. The most convenient trail was the mile-long dirt driveway to the abandoned house. Fair enough. I didn't have to ride the whole driveway and see the house. I could just go back and forth along the widened road and turn back before I reached the end of the driveway. So one day, I was doing this thing, got braver and braver, and eventually, I decided I would ride my horse up to the last turn, which was level with the house and where everyone parked their cars. I guess I was curious and just wanted to see this place up close now, as it had gotten dilapidated, and the grand deck looking pretty moldy. The driveway's end was all overgrown, which my horse was really excited about. We were doing walks and trots for a good hour or 2. His name was Tennessee. He was all sweaty and wet, and we walked up to the end of the driveway and immediately went for the tall grass, dipping his head down to about knee level to reach it, nibbling away. I know I was going to be in trouble for letting him eat grass, but I had to mention before anything else that this horse was not skittish. He was middle-aged and had been rodeo trick horse trained, and was not afraid of wimpy horse-carry things like loud noises or cars. He was intelligent and definitely the best trained animal I'd ever owned. He could even rear in a circle on his hind legs. It's one of those rodeo tricks. In any case, we were there for a good 5 minutes. The air was still, the day was hot, and the sun was shining. I was staring ahead. The house was to my right, and the horse and I were perpendicular to it down the mountain, and just zoning out. I admit that I felt watched, like I always did when I was near the house. But since I felt that way 99% of the time as a kid, it was easily ignored. But then I heard running footsteps in the empty house. I turned my head to look, and when I did, I got this insane feeling of dread. I half expected a bear to rush up on me. The worst part is just as this feeling hit me, my horse abruptly stopped his chewing and tensed up. I could feel it. His head shot to the right as well as his ears pointing forwards. That's when I internally went, "Oh shit!" Because the confirmation from my horse was that this whole thing was real. We stared at the house in unison, footsteps getting stronger and the feeling of dread gradually getting worse. And then suddenly, a scraping noise, like metal on metal. There was a huge swamp cooler in the large kitchen window, which got pulled inside as we stood there. I saw it wiggle and bang. It fell, and all the doors and windows shook. Whatever had been walking inside lifted this immensely huge thing and pushed it inwards because it wouldn't push outwards. When the swamp cooler disappeared, my horse straight up bolted. He had never done that before or since, even after being near gunshots or wild boars. He took off in a dead run, and I just let him go. I was absolutely terrified, and I remember hearing his hooves thundering along the dirt and gravel, and hearing the wind and my own heartbeat and just this ungodly roaring, almost like a lion or a bear. Anyway, that's the story. Make of it what you will. I very slyly told my dad that I had seen the swamp cooler missing from the window, and he went over to check and said the house had been ransacked, but nothing was stolen. He said it was human. There was no evidence of animals being inside, but the cabinets were opened and the food and belongings were thrown around. He was angry, thinking it was all vandalism, but he said all the doors were locked and the windows intact. Hey there, hope you enjoyed these stories. If you can, please like and subscribe. I would appreciate it. See you next time.